Hey guys, we are back with a new episode, but first, sorry for the long delay. We got stuck in the stress of our final exams. From now on, we will keep our promise and upload an episode every Friday. But it is hard to make a good podcast episode every week with the small team we have at the moment, so feel free to join us if you're keen using some of your time every week to give us a hand. As well, we have written and recorded the following episode 3 weeks ago, so the news is a bit older than planned. We hope you will still like it. So let's dig into that new episode talking about the climate deals our leaders made and sometimes disrespect.
Welcome to the International Youth Climate Podcast, Episode 4. In this episode, we will be talking about international agreements in which countries agree to do their part in combating climate change. We know from last agreements, like the Montreal Protocol in 1987, where countries agreed to phase out ozone-damaging chemicals to close the hole in the ozone layer at our atmosphere. That agreement, like this, can be successful if all countries agree to and abide by their terms. But before we start on that, here is the environmental news for this past week.
News section. There have been a multitude of environment-related news last week. This includes the presence of microplastics in our drinking water, the severe melting of Greenland's glaciers, and an extinction threat felt by monkeys primarily in South America. But first of all, we would like to begin with amazing news. Canada has declared climate emergency. Declaring a climate emergency is an acknowledgement that climate change stages a threat to human life as we know it, and that urgent action is needed to mitigate its disastrous effects. This is a crucial step on the road to decreasing one country's emissions. So well done, Canada! However, there is also some concerning news coming in from various countries. Last week, it was discovered that there are microplastics in our drinking water. Simply put, microplastics are very tiny pieces and particles of plastic that can be found almost everywhere. We can ingest them while eating seafood, breathe them through the air, or consume food with traces of its plastic packaging. A new study in the Journal of Environmental Science and Technology says that humans might be ingesting 39,000 to 52,000 microplastic particles a year. In this study, it was also found that people who drink mainly tap water consume an additional 4,000 particles a year, whereas those who primarily drink bottled water ingest an additional 90,000 particles a year. However, as this information was acquired fairly recently, scientists still don't exactly know the exact health impacts of ingesting these microplastics. In a study completed in 2017 at King's College, it was found that the accumulation of plastics in the body could be detrimental to humans' health. As there are different types of plastics, they have different properties and thus have different effects. Some plastics can easily absorb environmental pollutants, which can induce chemical toxicity in the human body and initiate or exacerbate a negative immune response. The accumulation of these microplastics are expected to worsen detrimental effects as time goes on. Researchers at Johns Hopkins University examining seafood contaminated with these microplastics found the immune system could be damaged by them. However, more research will be needed to conclusively understand at which those microplastics start having noticeable effects on health. Some more breaking news is that Greenland has lost a substantial amount of ice over this past week. While it is not unusual for some melting to occur on this hotter summer season, the melting rate registered on this Thursday, June 13, 2019, was significantly higher than is considered normal. Researchers say that having so much ice melting so early in the summer season could indicate that this year's melting trend could worsen. The reasons behind the severe melting are persistent weather patterns, Indeed, there has been a high-pressure ridge carrying warm, wet air from central Atlantic over Greenland, which leads to a warmer temperature over the ice sheets. This high pressure prevents the precipitation from forming, thus causing clear and sunny skies, letting more sunlight hit the ice directly. Over these past few weeks, this high-pressure ridge has gotten even stronger. If these extreme melting seasons were to become regular, they could cause disastrous effects across the globe, most notably being rising sea levels. Greenland has been a major contributor to a sea level rise in the past few decades due to surface melting and runoff. As well, a research completed by an international group of scientists has found out that a large percentage of monkeys, lemurs, and apes will be facing a substantial increase in temperatures and habitat changes in the next 30 years. They found out that primates living in tropical South America will be particularly affected. The researchers saw that these monkeys are highly vulnerable to increases in temperature and thus will be at a higher risk of extinction. In addition, the study also found out that changes in how humans use the land and alter existing primate habitats will amplify the negative effects of global warming on primate populations. The researchers concluded that urgent action is needed to introduce climate change mitigation measures in order to ensure that these primate populations won't be affected by high rates of extinction in the near future. And last but not least, this Friday was the first Central International Fridays for Future strike in Ländertreffen in Aachen, Germany. It was organized by activists participating in School Strike for Climate, Youth for Climate, and Fridays for Future. Youth strikers from around 15 European countries came to strike together for a better future. As well, on a Saturday, all activists will meet next to one of the biggest coal mines in Europe near Ochnenkirchen and have a teach-in with a Germany Kids TV show scientist about the impact of coal mining and global warming. We hope this strike can set off a signal to the governments around Europe that we need climate justice without seven borders now, because it is a problem that not just one country but the whole world is facing. If you could not be there in Aachen, we hope you had a lovely strike in your city.
That's all of our environmental news for this week. Before we start into expanding our first agreement in depth, there is a quick history and explanation of what climate agreements actually are.
Climate change, indeed, is the result of humanity's lifestyle, especially when taking into account the example of industrial superpowers and most developed nations. The much needed urgent action to prevent a climate crisis most often doesn't come as a voluntary effort. No government was willing to hurt its economy by taking the first step towards carbonic neutrality, and so, slowly, climatic associations started realizing that diplomacy was the path to start the change humanity needs in climate policy. Since the late 70s, international assemblies, such as the Conference of the Parties, were formed. In these nations from around the world decided the rules they should follow to prevent, to their best capacity, the inherent dangers of the current pollution standards and to set the debate on the responsibility of each country on the matters of CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. However, this change is taking longer than we hoped because political affairs take a large role in these negotiations, as in by discussions about the criteria by which the responsibility should be attributed. To put into perspective, 1979 marked the year of the first World Climate Conference, but the first impactful agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, was only signed in 1997, followed by the mediatic Paris Agreement in 2015 that imagines together 195 countries in what was described as an incredible feat. as citizens, it is crucial that we realize how these contracts can be improved since there's still a long way to go, both in making sure that the states involved follow the rules they committed to, part of our demands as youth strikers for climate, and in appealing for the rest of the world to meet and standards dictated by these treaties. Even though many experts share the view that these agreements are an illusion of action.
So now that you know all what climate agreements actually are, how important they are to help solve the climate crisis, let's start into our first agreement, the Kyoto Protocol.
The Kyoto Protocol is an international agreement committing its participants to reduce their emissions to a certain binding amount. As it recognizes that developed countries are responsible for the high levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, it sets diversified targets, decreasing its burden on underdeveloped countries. This protocol was adopted in Kyoto, Japan in 1997 and came into force on February 16, 2005. Its first phase, implemented by further accords signed in Marrakesh in 2001, ended in 2012, but another amendment, the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, was signed in Doha, Qatar on the 8th of December 2012. During the first period, 37 industrialized countries committed to lower their greenhouse gas emissions by 5% compared to those of 1990. During the second period, going from 2013 to 2020, instead the parties committed to decrease their emissions by at least 18% compared to 1990 levels. However, the countries participating to the Doha Amendment are partially different from those who committed to the first agreements. For example, Canada withdrew from the protocol in 2012. The reduction targets are set on 6 different greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Emission levels of these gases have to be monitored in each country and recorded in emission inventories once a year to ensure that the agreements are being respected and to help countries from having trouble keeping their emissions down. The treaty provides different ways to meet the requirements. For example, countries can invest in technology to lower emissions in a natural way, such as planting trees, or they can invest in the creation of new infrastructure in less developed countries, which wouldn't be able to afford them. For example, replacing a coal-fired power plant with wind turbines. Another way is to sell or buy emission rights within countries, putting an economical value on pollution. The protocol also establishes a fund, the Adaptation Fund, for those developed countries particularly affected by climate change to promote adaptation projects. If a country fails to respect the protocol, it is told by other countries what measures to adopt to reach the targeted emission levels. Its target can be lowered and the country can be excluded from the emission rights trade. Whether the first place of the protocol actually slowed down climate change is a very controversial matter, but what is sure is that the overall target was met. However, the Kyoto Protocol has been partially replaced by the Paris Agreement that was made in 2015. The initial protocol concerned 37 industrialized countries, plus the EU, but was signed by 192 countries. However, the United States withdrew from this agreement in 2001, and more than 100 developing countries were exempted from it, including China and India. The second phase of the Kyoto Protocol was signed off by the European Union, which together with Iceland agreed to jointly meet a 20% reduction target compared to the 1990 emissions. This means that European countries as a whole had to reduce their overall emissions in 1990 by 20%, but different countries have different reduction goals. However, these commitments have been replaced by the Paris Agreement's ones. Although during the first phase of the treaty the countries committing to it managed to globally respect it, scientists don't see the protocol as a success. Indeed, 10 countries managed to keep their emissions within the target only because they bought carbon credits, and the overall emissions naturally decreased because of the financial crisis which slowed down the economy. Additionally, emissions due to aviation and shipping weren't included in the reports, and several studies proved that they'd been increasing during those years. Another important failure is that the USA, China, India, and many developing countries weren't committing to the agreement, and they were free to pollute as much as they wanted to. Consequently, global emission rates didn't slow down, but instead they increased. On the other hand, the Kyoto Protocol was a milestone in the history of climate deals as it was signed by most countries around the world, excluding the USA, and proved that lowering emissions is actually possible if we adopt the correct laws. Additionally, it was in some ways the father of the Paris Agreement, which is supposed to have a bigger impact on the environment.
So now you have found out what some countries have already had to do to try and prevent the climate crisis, and that our leaders are taking some actions. Or maybe you discovered that your country refused to or wasn't obliged to do anything about it. Well, now we're going to tell you about a more recent agreement between 195 countries to keep global temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees Celsius, or at worst 2 degrees above the pre-industrial revolution average. The Paris Agreement. In December 2015, a meeting took place in Paris where 195 countries signed a climate deal. This means every country except Syria, Nicaragua, and the USA, who withdrew from the agreement in 2017 under President Trump, signed and now have to respect what is called the Paris Agreement. International agreements can be signed but will only become binding once they have been ratified or made official. The governments of these 195 countries all agree to the following points, but no law is forcing the governments to respect them. The countries agree to reduce emissions and to keep the rise of temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius. Their aim is to limit their increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Countries as well submitted National Climate Action Plans, INDCs. They decided to meet every 5 years to set more ambitious goals, targets, and respect transparency by reporting to each other and to the public how they are doing while respecting the targets. They also engage themselves to report their long-term thinking and plans. Concerning adaptation, the government agreed to strengthen society's ability to deal with the impact of climate change and to support the adaptation of developing countries. But as Corinne Le Carré, director of the Tyndall Center of Climate Change Research in England, said, there is not enough action. Most of the countries are struggling to achieve their goals set in 2015, even though they are rather modest. A group composed of 3 climate researchers called the Climate Action Tracker is keeping track of all the progress made by 32 of the countries who signed the agreement. These 32 countries are emitting 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions. They found out that the major polluters are only making very few or even no effort to reduce their emissions. There are only 2 countries who have presented a plan that could limit the rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The North African nation has committed the largest concentrated solar power plant in the world, scaled up its natural gas imports, and cut back fossil fuel subsidies. And the West African nation is one of the countries who are working on bending its emission in a downward trajectory. Part of the plan is to fight the erosion of soils by planting trees. India is working on renewable energy and could soon achieve its goal of producing 40% of its energy without fossil fuels. The National Post chose Germany to illustrate what is happening in Europe. The energy transition is one of the country's main goals, to be achieved before 2050, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2020. Despite setting these goals, the government rose in 2015 and in 2016 due to the burning of coal. Unless there are massive and rapid efforts, the German Environmental Agency says their goals will not be achieved. On the other side of the world, in the USA, the former President Donald Trump has rejected what Obama had signed before him, encouraging instead the development of the oil and gas industry while putting taxes on the import of solar panels. Brazil has not achieved to reduce deforestation, one of the main country's polluting factors. On the contrary, between 2012 and 2016, it nearly doubled. Some countries have not ratified at all the Paris Agreement, like Russia, that is the largest worldwide emitter. Since adopting the Climate Convention in 1992, Turkey who hasn't ratified it either, was heavily relied on fossil fuels, making its emission increase 135.4% between 1990 and 2016. Iran refuses to ratify it because it doesn't want to do an economic shift which is based upon oil and natural gases exports. The energy sector indeed represents 77% of the country's total emissions. In the Paris Agreement, if not respected, the temperature increase more than 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 degrees Celsius. Droughts and violent natural catastrophes would happen, threatening our food security. Water lacking that will hinder agriculture to develop. Because of the too warm temperatures, some plants may become inedible. Shelter will become a problem as well, knowing that 40% of the population lives 100 kilometers of coast. Between 1901 and 2010, the rate of sea level rise nearly doubled. This means that the coastal areas and small islands could disappear if we exceed 2 degrees Celsius. Entire nations could be threatened. Concerning health, the changes of temperature and rain pattern can lead to the spread of diseases such as malaria and Lyme disease. Because of health concerns, some regions could become uninhabitable. For example, the Middle East and the American West. The risk of dying from exposure will increase as well, as humidity and heat hinder the body from cooling itself down with sweat. These threats are not that far away, as scientists think that the Earth will exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius between 2032 and 2039, and the IPCC says that there is a 95% chance we will pass the 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. As you have heard, it is very important that all countries here respect this agreement. Otherwise, the consequences could be devastating and cost governments large amounts of money. Next, we're going to talk about our main source of information on the climate crisis, the IPCC reports.
IPCC stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. It has released 5 reports and 1 special, the special being the most recent, having been released in 2018. The special report was on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and it outlines the main causes, things being affected by climate change, and most importantly, how we can prevent it. These include over 6,000 scientific references, and it was prepared by 91 authors from 40 different countries. The report shows that we are quite far into the effects of climate change already, and only have approximately 12 years left until it is irreversible. It also highlights that quite a few of the impacts of climate change could be avoided by limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Within this target, things like the numbers of summers with an Arctic Ocean containing no ice would be around 1 per century, compared to at least 1 per decade with 2 degrees Celsius of warming. With warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would lose about 70% to 90% of coral reefs, though with global warming of 2 degrees Celsius, we would lose virtually everything. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will give us more room to adapt. Some countries have taken this report very seriously and have made major changes, although others haven't been as willing to change how things are done in their country. Countries such as Australia and the USA are not on track to decrease global warming or meet the commitments under the Paris Agreement, which the USA isn't even a part of any longer. Although Canada, the European Union, and New Zealand have made steps towards decreasing their environment. Sadly, some of the most vulnerable countries, such as India, who are most at risk, haven't really reacted yet.
We have heard about what most countries around the world are doing to play their part in stopping global warming and preventing the climate crisis. But what about the United States of America? Well, they do have a plan to switch to renewable energy, but different parties have different views on it, and is not yet legally binding. Green New Deal. The Green New Deal has been a point of disagreement for Democrats in the USA and the subject of mockery from Republicans. It was first introduced by Democratic Congressman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and is an ambitious through open says unrealistic plan to get the USA to reef all of its energy from 100% renewable sources by 2030. When it comes to how much it will cost, Republicans have been tossing around the figure of $93 trillion. However, while it is true that no one knows how much the Green New Deal will cost, the Republicans' total is based on a report from a conservative think tank, American Action Forum, which did not state this number anywhere in the report. The 14-page resolution is vague and includes economic reform such as providing all citizens with free healthcare and affordable, safe, and adequate housing, along with guaranteeing a job with a family sustainable wage, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacations, and requirement security for all people of the United States. Though proponents say that this is vital so that fossil fuel workers can transfer into renewable energy sector. Opponents also urge that economic reform is unnecessary, some going as far to call it a leftist wish list and a liberal fantasy. What these opponents forget, though, is that the Green New Deal is a non-binding resolution. It is more of a roadmap than an actual policy, though policies have to be created around it, or could be created around it. That all are topics for the week. Do you think that your leaders could and should be doing more to meet the requirements of these agreements and to prevent the climate crisis? If so, let them know by striking with your local Friday for Future or a school strike for climate group. You could also contact them directly and tell them what you think needs to be done. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast, and we hope that you will join us next week and learn more about climate change. Bye.